Good afternoon and welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, July 29th, 2020. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. Really grateful to be joined by another guest in our Champions of Broadband series. But before we get to that, I just wanted to remind everyone to share your comments or questions, if you got any, with the hashtag BroadbandLive. For our guest, who we'll be hearing from momentarily. I also want to remind everyone that we are going to have our special mini conference on digital infrastructure investment on Monday, August 10th. That's a week and a half from now. Obviously, we have these events every Wednesday at noon as a kind of a regular, consistent event for those who read and follow our focus on better broadband, better lives. This event on Monday, August 10th, will be a special event that gathers together infrastructure and financing communities focused on broadband investment. And the event will be, you have to register to attend, and please do go to broadbandbreakfast.com and you can find all the information there. And this will also be included as part of the Broadband Communities virtual summit that will take place later in the fall. But for the event and to participate, just go to broadbandbreakfast.com. Also, I wanted to just kind of remind everyone that we'll be back here every week for the next five weeks or so with another episode of Broadband Breakfast Live Online, Champions of Broadband. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest for today, Jim Baller. Jim is a well-recognized expert in the field of broadband, public broadband, municipal community broadband, and we're going to be able to explore some of the topics around this with Jim in I hope, a pretty comprehensive way. We got a little taste of this on some end when we spoke last week with Bob Frankston, and next week we will have Mignon Clyburn, the former acting chair of the FCC and a commissioner, and she'll speak as well about her experiences, and we have others in later weeks. But for now, we want to focus on Jim, who is the president of Baller Stokes Lyde, a law firm in Washington, and as you can see on your bio, if you're watching this on Broadband Breakfast, you can see a lot of information about some of the history, clients, awards, and advocacy that Jim's been involved with through the Coalition for Local Internet Choice and through the Us Broadband Coalition. Jim, why don't I start with the question about how did you get interested in broadband? What led you to the first step along the way to advocating for high capacity broadband everywhere?
Drew, thanks very much for having me here. I enjoy our many conversations over the years, and I applaud your series. I've watched some of it. It's terrific. So how did I get into this field? Back in 1993, I was an energy attorney who had a lull in my practice. So I accompanied a partner to a conference given by the American Public Power Association on the Cable Act amendments of 1992. APPA was the organization that represents the interests of 2,000 or so publicly owned electric utilities, and the purpose of the conference was to discuss how the Cable Act amendments, which were intended to encourage competition in the cable industry, might affect them. Municipal electric utilities at the time were heading toward a cycle of upgrading their infrastructure to advanced communication capabilities, and with those capabilities, they could provide cable, telephone, the nascent broadband that was there at the time. At the end of the conference, APPA passed out a sign-up sheet for its members to contribute to hiring outside counsel to work with APPA on the wave of rulemakings that the FCC was going to launch to implement the Cable Act amendments. And I volunteered to do it pro bono. APPA accepted, and in the following couple of years, I worked with with the most advanced people in the public power community, particularly Billy Ray of Glasgow, Kentucky. We got regulations that were very welcoming of entry by municipal utilities. And as part of my responsibilities, I wrote a paper comparing this time in the communications field with the comparable period of electrification. And the parallels were so striking that this became a topic of conversation that has grown over the years. So
Jim, let me just cut in. Your sound is kind of going in an arc and kind of just down and up and down and up. I don't know if you could just maybe adjust your volume to be a little bit higher, or see if you could be a little bit closer to the microphone, because it's steady when it's good, but it's going in and out. So just to kind of heads up on that, okay?
Okay, all right. I'm done with that answer in any event. So that's how I got interested in broadband.
What I found fascinating about this, Jim, is the competition angle, right? So the Cable Act and the role it played. And one of the themes we're going to be speaking about, of course, here is the parallels to electrification, right? And the rural electrification movement, the 10s and 20s and 30s. But just for a moment on the Cable Act of 1992, what was it about the Cable Act that prompted the public power, the energy systems to say, hey, this might be something that we can use to get into this field?
Well, they didn't really look at it as this is something we can use to get into this field. Their concern was that, as in the electric power field, they would be left out as the nation moved toward services, that they would be left out unless they had a path to enter the field. They saw the same challenges of economic development, educational opportunity, and all the other benefits that electricity provided being available to those communities that had advanced communication services. And they saw this not just as an opportunity to compete for cable service. Very few of them entered for that reason. They had a broader view of how communications would benefit communities, and it's that drove them to pursue advanced communication systems.
Say a word or two about some of these earliest models and pioneers. Glasgow, for instance, you mentioned. To tell our audience where that is and what was path-breaking about 4 megabits per second in 1994.
Right. Glasgow, Kentucky is a small community of about 14,000, just north of the border with Tennessee. And at the time, many of us were using dial-up to have access to the internet. At the time, broadband was not even on the radar for many of us. Even years later, the FCC defined high-speed communications as 2 kilobits per second, and Glasgow, by 1994, already had 4 megabits download capacity. 1994. Bear in mind that 4 megs was the current standard in 2015, when the FCC, under Chairman Tom Wheeler, raised the limit to 25 down and 3 up. So that can give you a sense of how far in advance of much of the rest of the country Glasgow was at the time, and it provided a model that many other municipal electrics followed.
Yeah. Now, more recently, a lot of the electric power systems that have gone into broadband, and I'm thinking right now of Chattanooga and the role that they had. My understanding is that a lot of times it was driven by a kind of a smart grid concern and electric metering, and obviously, you know, the benefits of big broadband, fast broadband kind of came along. Was that at all in the cards in some of these early 90s deployments of electric power systems?
It was, and it continues to be. bear in mind that advanced communications aren't discrete systems that serve only a single purpose. You don't have a system just for cable, just for electricity. It's basically the same infrastructure that can be used in multiple ways to serve multiple needs at the same time. In fact, Glasgow got into the communications business in part because this was a way for it to make its acquisition of electricity from the Tennessee Valley Authority more efficient and cost effective. That need has evolved over time. There are many more uses for advanced communication services, and that continues to be a large part of the motivation of public power and other communities that get into the field or pursue getting into the field. Drew, can I just add one more point here?
Please.
And this is in part the core values of the Coalition for Local Internet Choice. To think about this, advanced communication services like electricity of the prior century is a platform, driver, and enabler of simultaneous progress in just about everything that matters to communities, including things like economic development and educational opportunity and access to modern, affordable health care and smart transportation. And the list is public safety. The list goes on and on and on. And that's why so many communities across the country are seeking to work with willing incumbent carriers or to partner with new entrants or to provide services themselves if need be, or to develop creative new methods of getting access to these advanced systems. And so that's what's at stake here. It's not a question of competing for limited internet access or cable television. It's a question of having the fundamental core infrastructure that will enable communities that have access to it to progress as all of these fields progress at the same time. And if you don't have that, it's not just a question of not being able to have a Zoom conversation, although it is that too. There's so much more at stake as a result of all that advanced systems.
Yeah. Well, we want to get to some of the good modern things that are happening, but I can't resist two more kind of detours. One quick and the other a little bit longer. And a reminder to just please try to talk as close in the mic. So we are hearing you a little better, but want to make sure we keep hearing you good. So on the analogies to the rural electrification movement, and I know you and I have talked about this for years, if not decades. What is it that is most salient about the way rural electrification rolled out in this country that, to your mind, invites parallels to the rollout of broadband? What is it? And you started to answer that question already a little bit in the platform and the advanced communications. But could you just speak a little bit about maybe the politics of rural electrification? How did that sort of figure into what we're seeing now with broadband?
Okay, let me start 50 years earlier in the 1880s. Sometimes people think that municipal electrics or public power electrics that provide communication services started to do so in the 1930s with the enactment of the Rural Electrification Act. In fact, they began in the 1880s, and they did it to fill gaps left by the private sector, and a number of large cities found that they could provide electricity at half the cost and just as well, if not better, than the private sector. So you have a number of cities in the US, Cleveland, Los Angeles, Seattle, many others that have public power there. But providing electric networks requires the economics to work. And even the public power utilities could not economically serve the more rural areas that were untouched to a great extent over that 50-year period to the mid 1930s. And then, as part of the New Deal legislation, the Roosevelt administration decided to attack the problem of rural electrification, created the Rural Electrification Administration to support the creation of cooperatives. At the same time, a number of major hydropower projects were created to provide cheap electricity to the cooperatives. Now, pulling forward to today, what we're seeing is that cooperatives that serve the most rural areas are beginning to step up with great interest in providing broadband services. A number of states have eased their path to doing that by removing some restrictions or lessening some restrictions. Now, rural cooperatives and public power utilities have much in common. They're both consumer owned, so they serve the consumers who are the beneficiaries of their services. They have assets like poles, ducts, conduits, rights of way. They have experience in providing consumer services. They have experience with customer care, with billing, with all sorts of things that give them an advantage in shifting over to the provision of advanced communication services. Still, the areas that cooperatives serve are very sparsely populated in many cases. And fortunately, we've seen a number of federal programs recently, and hopefully more coming, that will make the brutal economics of deploying broadband in these sparse areas much more inviting than they've been. And we hope that as time goes on, recognition of the role that cooperatives can play, as well as recognition of the role that communities can play, either through electric utilities or through partnerships, are good for our country and essential to hastening the time when we can say that we have brought robust broadband to all Americans, and that restrictions that currently exist on public broadband networks are also removed or cut back.
Right. Excellent. So let's kind of get into the heart of some of these issues, these legal issues that you've been so involved with, and I think that you're moving us back not only to the Cable Act but to electrification and beyond. The Rural Electrification Act is important. But now, starting with the Telecom Act of 1996, obviously it was designed to reform, overhaul many aspects of the cable and telecom structure, and you obviously worked on some aspects of, as you wrote to me, comparing the telecom changes going on with the period of electrification. What did you hope would come from the Telecom Act in regards to public broadband? And I'm asking that, of course, with an eye to the challenges that followed, and some of the, I guess I described it a bit of a legal box. I mean, no other way to say it. You can help me illuminate if that's incorrect. But in America, of course, we have a system of federalism. The states have a dual sovereignty with the federal government, and municipalities take their powers largely from the states. And so could you just walk us through some of those issues that were in play in the lead up to the Nixon v. Missouri case that you were involved in, and what that kind of teaches us for how we need to tackle this issue going forward?
Okay. As more and more networks like Billy Ray's that began in '89 and a number of others cropped up in the early '90s, this is even before, as a general matter, the 92 Cable Act amendment, FCC's rules further encouraged their entry. The incumbent communications providers began to push some states to adopt restrictions on the ability of government entities or public entities to provide communication services. As it happens, while the debate on the 96 Act was going on, Texas adopted a law that prohibited municipalities and municipal utilities from providing communication services, telecommunication services, directly or indirectly. We responded to that in Washington through allies by getting language inserted in the Communications Act that said roughly that no state statute, regulation, or other legal requirement may prohibit or have the effect of prohibiting the ability of any entity to provide any telecommunication service. That language was interpreted by the FCC in a number of cases, state courts and federal courts in a number of cases, and we eventually wound up before the Supreme Court in a case called Nixon versus Missouri Municipal League. In that case, the Supreme Court said that when a statute is said to be preemptive, a federal statute is said to preempt state power that's fundamental and traditional, a heightened level of instruction is applied to that. In such a case, Congress must have spoken so clearly and unambiguously that there can be no doubt about its intent to preempt. And in the particular language, we had said that no state statute may adversely affect the ability of any entity to provide any telecommunications service. And the Supreme Court said, applying that heightened standard, we can't be sure that Congress was talking about all entities, including public entities or private entities. So we are required to interpret the statute narrowly, and we find that it does not preempt statutes of the kind we're talking about. Some years later, in a case involving the statutes, the barriers of Tennessee and North Carolina, Commissioner or Chairman Wheeler's FCC found that those statutes are, in fact, anti-competitive, contrary to the pro-competitive purposes of the Communications Act, and they stifle broadband investment. The FCC preempted those laws. The United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, like the Supreme Court, applied the heightened standard and said under this other section of law, we can't find that we're absolutely sure that Congress intended to preempt. So I think it's fair to say we're probably at the end of the road with courts interpreting the existing communication laws as preemptory of state barriers. We need Congress to speak clearly so that this issue is removed once and for all. And happily, there's a lot of pressure mounted.
Well, and that's certainly important. I guess I do note, though, that there's a bit of a tension, and this kind of goes both ways, right? Because the FCC's been increasingly preempting cities on their role in rights of way, right? And so you have kind of federalism from the federal government of preempting municipalities and states, but at the same time the federalism where the states can control the cities. So how do we get out of this problem? And I think you've mentioned the Community Broadband Act. Is that a specific piece of legislation that's already been introduced this Congress, Jim, or is that kind of a legacy bill that others have introduced in the past?
It's both. It is a legacy bill. It's been introduced several times over the years. In fact, in 2006, we got it all the way through the House of Representatives and all the way through the Senate Commerce Committee before the profile of Congress changed and no significant federal telecom legislation passed since then. There have been more recent efforts to resurrect the Community Broadband Act. There are currently bills on for Congress that include language similar to it. And as I said a few moments ago, there seems to me to be mounting enthusiasm for getting rid of barriers of all kinds to all kinds of models. As a nation, especially one that's facing what we've learned about the essential access to affordable, robust broadband through this pandemic, we cannot afford to shut down or restrict any viable model that can help us solve this problem in the short term.
Right. Well, let's talk specifically about recent developments, not only emanating from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, but more recently the founding and your role in founding the Coalition for Local Internet Choice. Could you speak to those developments and what sort of optimistic or hopeful progress you've seen over the last 5 or 6 years, Jim?
Okay, thank you. In 2014, Joanne Hovis and I founded the Coalition for Local Internet Choice, CLIC we call it, to support communities that are fighting for the ability for communities to play a significant role in the critical broadband deployment, adoption, and use decisions that will affect their community for decades to come. As we know, there are roughly 20 states that have restrictions in this area. Virtually every year, we are fighting the introduction of new restrictions or seeking to remove existing ones. And we created CLIC to be supportive of people across the country in addressing that problem. I mentioned earlier what CLIC's dominant philosophy is, but let me also add that we strongly support local governments making the decisions that affect them because we believe that what works in one community will not necessarily work in the next community over or 2 communities over. There are so many different circumstances that need to be addressed one by one, and communities are in the best position to make those decisions informed by experiences elsewhere and across the country and with decisions in the hands of their elected decision makers. And so CLIC has grown over the years. We now have more than 600 organizational and white papers and other information to help people have at hand the tools that they need to have informed conversations with legislators. We particularly encourage consideration of public-private partnerships because we don't believe this is an issue that is public versus private. We believe that finding the best solutions that work for both the public sectors is something that is well worth striving for. We hold full day, half day webinars and other educational events, and we're hoping that the need for CLIC will someday soon end, but realistically, we know that we're not going to see revolutionary change all at once, and that we're going to keep doing the best that we can.
Now, Jim, we've talked about making sure that broadband is not a partisan issue, and I know this is a theme that you've genuinely focused on for years, and I of course support that, making sure it's not a partisan issue. At the same time, I do want to give you an opportunity to respond to some critics who sometimes say that having the municipality or municipal government involved in broadband is kind of like, internet socialism. First, your reaction to that argument, if it is such, and secondly, how do we make sure that local internet choice is not just a partisan issue, or is not a partisan issue?
Well, I would prefer not to get caught up in terms like socialism, but I'd like to focus on the core of what we're talking about. We are talking about people serving their own best interest through informed local choice. If they can provide a service to themselves using wise technology, deploying funding that is available to them, why shouldn't they do that? Why are we in the business of supporting corporations and other organizations, or is it the other way around? Let me give you an example. When we moved into our neighborhood some years ago, my wife noticed that our playground was past its prime, and she gathered together the neighborhood and decided that we were going to upgrade the playground. So those of the neighbors who had skills in working with people who could sell us the appropriate playground equipment did that. Eventually, the equipment was delivered. We had a weekend where the neighborhood built a perfectly good playground. Now, when you step back and you think about that, what would have happened if the playground industry sought legislation saying that we couldn't do this as neighbors because they had some inherent right to provide playgrounds for people? And on top of that, we couldn't do it just at the cost of the equipment, our own labor. We had to somehow impute their profits and pay somebody the profits so that we would not have an advantage in building our own playground. One could say that the experience of developing municipal systems is comparable. You're seeing particularly communities that have their own electric utilities and others that seek to work with private partners. They have an opportunity to get good service that's more affordable and go forward with that. And in some cases, they'll find that willing incumbents are willing and able to provide them services that are good enough to persuade them that they should not go the route of public-private partnership or a publicly owned and operated network. Our point simply is, let's not get hung up talking about socialism. Let's talk about our bigger goals as a nation. Why wouldn't it be great if our whole country had access to high-capacity broadband that we could use for all of the purposes that we need, that enabled us as a country to benefit in healthcare and in economic development and all those other areas? That should be something that is not only nonpartisan, it should be bipartisan, and that's what you and I and others have been saying for years.
Now you mentioned the role of public-private partnerships as well. When we're talking about incumbents, is it a choice between incumbents kind of serving and the municipality stepping up to the plate, or how would you envision a public-private partnership where the municipality or county says, well, we want to do this piece of it, but we'll invite private providers to be involved in this piece of it? Could you just talk a little bit about the public-private partnership model that you've seen most successful?
There is no one public-private partnership model that I've seen as being so clearly superior to others. I start with the premise that each community is different, what it brings to the table, what it needs, what others are willing to bring to that community differ from case to case. The preferences, the risk profile will change from community to community. Politics will change from community to community. And it's a question of going through a process to enlighten oneself first from a community standpoint as to what the community needs, what it has, what its goals are, and what is missing. At that point, we have a typical process that we go through: request for information, to start a conversation, to put your goals out there, bring into the community potential partners to talk with the community. We've often found several providers come in and talk to the community. It gets educated process. Eventually, it knows enough that it can enter a more formal procurement process, all the while refining its conception of what it needs and what it wants. And so there are many different kinds of public-private partnerships, ranging from very low risk for local governments in cooperating, expediting the deployment by private providers on the one hand, to, on the other hand, doing some or most services itself, taking on more significant risks and retaining more control over networks. This same structural model we talk about in the context of public-private partnerships is structurally similar to partnerships that are also emerging that are not necessarily public-private. We have public-public projects, such as one that Westfield is operating in Western Massachusetts, where local government entities are supporting the efforts of more than 20 communities. You have private-private partnerships, such as Alabama Power and Alabama. So there are many different kinds of public-private partnerships. And if communities are serious about moving forward, it's something that we think is very well worthwhile to explore.
What are some of the best resources? Like if a community is watching this and thinks, I really want to start exploring this, in addition to Click, what are some other places those communities should go to?
Well, first of all, it is often the case that your first step should be comparable communities. Communities that have experience, both positive and negative, tend to be very eager to talk about their experiences. So you can learn a lot about how to learn from talking about these projects with communities. Now, an increasing number of organizations have formed toolkits and have developed other kinds of advice to take you through another level of understanding of these projects. I might mention the Fiber Broadband Association, Michigan.
Could you repeat that? We heard Fiber Broadband Association, and then what was next after that?
In Michigan, the Michigan Moonshot Project put together excellent resources last couple of years. I'd highly recommend that. The Institute for Local Self-Reliance, Chris Mitchell and his team have developed excellent educational materials. At the government level, the NTIA, the National Telecommunications.
Sorry, again, you're talking about, did you say the NTIA?
Yeah, right. NTIA has developed lots of tools. So there's no lack of tools to bring you from general to more specific information. But when you get to the point where you really want to get serious about entering into partnerships agreements or valuing your assets, pricing what you need, at that point, you really would benefit from expert advice. And there are several excellent consulting firms that are available out in the field that really know what they're doing and can help you out.
Good. Thank you for pulling the microphone a little bit closer there, and maybe want to adjust. There you go, so we can see your face. So Jim, let's talk a little bit about the federal role in broadband. We've talked a lot about the local role and the kind of complications and interactions between localities and states. Let's talk about the federal role, and I want to, of course, start with the Recovery Act of 2009, but also the National Broadband Plan. And you obviously spearheaded a very ambitious initiative called the Us Broadband Coalition in that period of time. I had the privilege of being involved in a small way in that. I almost want to look at it as maybe a case study. What lessons did you learn from putting together this Us Broadband Coalition, trying to build a wide tent around broadband, and what of it stuck and what of it didn't stick, right? And from that, kind of what can we learn going forward about broadband policy, either in the current administration or in any future administration? What are some of the things that we can look forward to as we push for those goals of higher capacity broadband, better use of broadband, and the benefits that flow from that?
Okay, well, what you're referring to is an effort that I began in about 2006, and that ultimately in 2008, 2009 resulted in the coming together of entities from just across the spectrum. We had incumbents, we had local governments, we had labor unions, educational institutions, we had you name it, they were represented in this coalition. And what we talked about was, what questions do we need to ask? What are our barriers to achieving a national broadband strategy worthy of a great nation? What kinds of issues of metrics were involved? And Drew, you played a very prominent role as co-chair of our metrics commission, our metrics committee. And to me, the single most important thing about this whole exercise, what drove me more than anything else, was that I wanted us to establish national goals that were high enough for a great nation to embrace, and that were reachable enough so that we could build a path from where we were at the time in that period to something that we would actually work toward over the course of the next decade. At the time, there was so little understanding of big picture, so little consensus on anything really. And that's why it turned out to be so amazing that we were able to pull together a call to action to whichever party won the elections of 2008. And the call to action presented the big issues that we thought needed to be addressed and the framework for addressing those issues. We presented those at a big meeting on Capitol Hill on December 2nd, 2008. And right about that time, the US economy collapsed. And so Congress was amenable to major significant efforts to ameliorate problems across the economy, including broadband. It took the ideas of our coalition on the need to recognize not just that we needed significant federal investment in broadband deployment, but also in broadband adoption and use. It recognized that we needed more than just a vague strategy, but a national broadband plan. And so in the American, see if I can still get, an American Restoration and Recovery Act. I know I've got 3 of the 4 things right. Congress created the BTOP and BIP programs, and it required the FCC to develop a national broadband plan. And I thought that the process itself was wonderful because it caused people to think about where we were, what needed to be done. I was somewhat disappointed in the plan that ultimately emerged, not because I thought that it fell short of what was possible to do, but because of how difficult it was to lift all segments of the United States so quickly into a common path. So we call this a national broadband plan, but it was not so much a plan with specific milestones and specific things to do over a period of time that could result in measurable progress, but it was aspirational, and it needed to be. It really needed to be aspirational. Let me also say that another important element to this picture emerged, not so much in the National Broadband Plan itself or the Broadband Technology Opportunity Program, the BIP program, but in Google's Fiber for Communities project that came right on the heels of those. So you had across the country communities looking at themselves saying, what can I do with advanced communications services? What is preventing me from getting there? All across the country, this was happening as a result of the federal stimulus program, the Google project, and the work on the National Broadband Plan. And I don't know how to possibly say this in an objective way, but I think that we advanced by at least 5 years, or at least double the amount of time that we actually spent because of these things coming together. Now we still have far to go, but from the standpoint of where we were in 2008 to where we were in, say, 2015, we made a tremendous amount of progress in that.
Well, thank you. I think it's really important that you raised Google Fiber and Google in the communities. And some people did refer to that as like the 3rd round of BTOP, right? I mean, there were only 2 rounds, but I think you've captured it right, that more than 1,000, I think it was 1,100 communities raised their hands and said, we want to be considered for the the city that was ultimately chosen as Kansas City. Now, obviously, Google went on to do several more, but it of course made a high-profile turnaround a couple of years back on their fiber build. And I do feel like we should talk about, well, what does that mean, right? Google's retreating from that. And while, maybe 10 years ago, Google was looked at in a very positive light, I mean, at this very moment, as we speak, the CEO of Google and several other tech companies are being questioned by a House Judiciary Committee hearing. So that has changed a little bit, and I wonder, does the pressure that Google feels on a number of fronts impact its ability to do kind of moonshot ideas like Google Fiber? What in your view led them to curtail that, and what does that say about the future of communities that want to get broadband capacity in their communities?
Well, first of all, Drew, I would suggest that you have someone from Google asked to ask questions that they are obviously in a much better position than I am. I would look back and say, I don't know all of the reasons why Google paused. Prominent reasons, among others, the resistance of incumbent carriers giving them access to poles and other critical infrastructure that significantly delayed deployments and made them much more expensive. I'm sure that Google learned a great deal in that process that they benefited from in understanding what the terrain was like. I would just note it has recently been in the news that Google and West Des Moines have gotten together on a very interesting conduit build out, where Des Moines is building conduit throughout the city. On fiber.
Just repeat that. You mentioned Google and West Des Moines and their conduit program. Could you just repeat that?
Yes. West Des Moines will be building out conduit throughout the city, and Google will be their first tenant to run fiber through the conduit. And this is, I won't say it's entirely a new kind of program. In Lincoln, Nebraska, Allo Communications has done a conduit project as well. But this is yet another kind of partnership that you can add to the list of things.
I think you're raising the conduit program really brings to at least one topic area that I want us to cover, and that is, what is your perspective on the future of wholesale access or open access, and the role where cities play one piece of it on the infrastructure end, or even if it's just conduit or dark fiber, and some other players are involved in the provisioning of services and or the network operations. Could you just speak to the success or lack thereof of open access models in the United States versus other countries around the world, Jim?
Well, in the United States, let's go back a few years. Initially, networks had to succeed or fail on their own. Subsidies of networks were frowned upon, and finding ways for networks to pay for themselves was very difficult to do. A number of networks that enabled the network developers and operators to provide retail services as well as wholesale services were successful, and a number of networks that tried to develop a wholesale only or a fiber only business model struggled for a while, because it's just very difficult to be successful with those models. But as we've evolved, more and more situations have presented themselves where wholesale open access networks might very well work. There's more funding available to support these networks that might be used. Creative uses of federal and state and other kinds of funding, piecing them together so that they support networks that might not have been viable before are emerging. But again, Drew, I stress the same point that I've made several times today and over during the last 20 odd years I've been involved in this. It all depends on specific circumstances, and blanket statements that this is the best of all models and this is an inferior model only can take you so far. And I'm pleased to see that there's an evolution that has happened over the years. And there are more ways for networks to be successful, all worthy of being explored.
Yeah, to paraphrase Tip O'Neill, all broadband is local, and there are so many facets. I guess if I can ask one more question before offering your any additional final thoughts you have, Jim. So the Community Broadband Act we talked about that you're supportive of would empower communities and give them the opportunity, the flexibility, the clear authority to do what they're often stymied on a state level in 19 or 20 states. What would be your wish list in terms of funding? How should universal service, or how should a new infrastructure bill, if we were so fortunate as to have such a bill that had significant funding for broadband, what should it be doing? So again, speaking and closing out perhaps on local, what's the local policy, and federal, what's the federal policy?
Okay, point number one, there should be no restrictions on the ability of local governments to develop their own networks or to partner for networks or to develop other creative means of ensuring that their communities have access to affordable broadband. So that's number one. Number two, when it comes to funding, that's a different question, but we would answer it that they should be able to compete in a non-discriminatory way for funds. They may well be the best of all situated entity in a particular situation to make those funds work successfully. And their proposals should be judged just as any other proposals should be. And third, I'd say that stepping back from all of this, Blair Levin has called for a revisit of the development of the National Broadband Plan. There are bills in the Senate and the House that would fund a new round of National Broadband Plan development. I think that's a great idea. Among other reasons I think that's a great idea is that we have lots of programs now coming out of FCC, coming out of the Department of Agriculture, coming out of the Department of Commerce's Economic Development Administration, don't necessarily integrate very well with one another. Gotten support from a program here in the past, you may not be eligible for funding to increase the capacity of a network that was previously supported at an intermediate or lower level of capacity. It would be excellent if we could have a fresh look at how all these programs work and whether they could be made more efficient in terms of working at common purposes rather than sometimes cross purposes. And in all of that, we hope that public entities are treated with the respect that they deserve, because they can make a very significant contribution to the broad goal of making America great again in broadband.
Great. Well, that will be the last word. Thank you so much, Jim Baller, for being with us, for sharing your lessons learned from your career on the front lines of getting a better broadband, higher capacity, and the services that flow from it. Next week at 12 noon Eastern Time, we'll have Mignon Clyburn on Champions of Broadband, Broadband Breakfast Live Online. And don't forget to register for Digital Infrastructure Investment taking place on Monday, August 10th at 1 p.m. I'm Drew Clark of Broadband Breakfast. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you next week.